All right, guys, now a very natural cousin to both the Joe and the short spear is the bayonet. Bayonets have enjoyed a very long history in infantry warfare. The earliest versions were really intended to be a backup for the firearm once it was out of ammunition. They were termed plug-in bayonets because they would literally plug into the open barrel of the rifle. So that meant you couldn't load it, you couldn't fire it. The supposition was that you weren't going to when you were going to hand-to-hand range. These plug-in bayonets were extremely effective for hundreds of years. The bayonet charge with masses of soldiers running at one another or even running into gunfire was a central component of tactics, resulted in huge casualties. During this entire period, we see a huge concern with the length of the bayonet, literally a battle of inches, with people favoring longer rifles and longer bayonets, and if you had a slightly shorter rifle, trying to compensate with longer bayonets, even the inclusion of so-called sword bayonets, which were full functional swords affixed to the rifle. It really wasn't until the beginning, the early 1900s, that we saw trench warfare in World War I and a complete paradigm shift on the perspective of the bayonet. At this point, maneuverability in close quarter combat became much more of a consideration, and shorter bayonets started to be considered. If we look at the earliest designs of bayonets, many of them, like this early 1900s Chinese bayonet, were either square or triangular with multi-facets. This one is kind of grooved in a square design. When I first encountered these, I was erroneously told, and in fact I've read it in many books and I've had it repeated to me by a lot of military personnel, that the triangular or square bayonet created a more gaping wound that was more difficult to stitch, and that it even violated the Geneva Convention. Now I've looked, guys, there are some clauses in the Geneva Convention talking about the inhumanity of causing undue harm to an individual after an encounter has ended, and so I can see how people can interpret a wound that is more difficult to stitch and close and heal from as falling into that category. But there is no specific mention of either square or triangular bayonets, and they are not in fact illegal. I think the main reason they were first created was that if you're mass producing these things by hand, it's a much easier design to literally hammer out. But much more than that, bayonets were primarily an impaling weapon. They were intended for stabbing. And the earliest designs were really like a pike rather than a flat-bladed spear. As such, if I want to go for longer and longer length, a square or triangular shape, especially like this with these little fluted grooves, will still keep it lightweight but make it much stronger for piercing and penetrating. So while this is really not that effective for slashing beyond a deep scratch, for stabbing this will go in extremely deeply and is unlikely to fail or bend. As such, if I have a bayonet that's designed for stabbing, and everybody using it is stabbing, we know that stabbing wounds tend to go deeper into the body, affect more body systems, and as such be more dangerous. So I think that's the real reason why the square and triangular bayonet is more devastating. It's that it's intended to stab and not to slash. Later on, we will see there's still a heavy emphasis on stabbing. The blade on this is not in any way sharp to the hand, but we see a shorter length. So if you compare that, and of course there are bayonets far longer than this, and these shorter length bayonets would be easier to maneuver in a tight range, tight confined space. As automatic gunfire increases as well, we also see soldiers going from marching into death shoulder to shoulder, and now they're spreading out. We have bombs and mortars, grenades, machine gun fire, craters everywhere, and soldiers running in a much more frantic and erratic way. And as such, it now benefits you to have a bladed item that can also slash. Modern bayonets tend to be much more of a functional utility knife that will have oftentimes serrated edges like this one, a sharpened edge. This is an AK bayonet, so in this case you have this ability to affix this, and by doing this you have a functioning wire cutter in this respect here through this joint. The scabbard, the sheath on this is insulated as well, so that if I do encounter any sort of electrical shock from it, it'll protect my hand. There's a little grooved hook at the end just for quick wire cutting or quick rope cutting as well. And it's thin enough to be used as a lever or a pry bar. The knife is fully functional. It's a great tool as well. So we increasingly see the modern bayonet being much more of a multi-purpose functional tool that can also be affixed to a rifle. Now, although bayonet charges have fallen from primary roles in combat, there are still plenty of instances of them occurring. There's a very famous instance in the Falkland Island War. There was a very famous instance in the Iraq War. Even during Afghanistan, there are numerous instances of close quarter combat, room clearing, where people have fixed bayonets to assist this. And of course, military units like the Marines still train the bayonet as a basic component of warfare. So what we're going to do in this section is we're just going to take a quick look at the history of its use and some of the most essential tactics to keep it as simple as possible should you be in a position where you require the use of a bayonet.